This is not a time when women should be patient. We are in a war, and we need to fight it with all our ability and every weapon possible. Women pilots in this particular case are a weapon waiting to be used. Eleanor Roosevelt. Strong words spoken by a strong woman, at a time in history where a woman's role in society was changing. World War II brought about many changes in the lives of people throughout the world, but the role of women especially saw dramatic changes both socially and professionally. The women who explored air flight in the military encountered many challenges in their journey, but their experiences helped change women's lives forever. In early settlements of America, a woman's life tended to center around farm and family. For the most part, labor was observed, whereby men did the outside work such as planting and harvesting crops, while women worked inside the house, transforming the raw products into usable commodities. All of a woman's work comes under the general heading of housewife, and it varied from region to region. During World War I, the rapidly expanding war industries dipped heavily into the labor force of women. In 1918, the breakout of America's involvement into World War I, nearly 3 million new women workers were employed in food, textile, and war industries. As men went off to war, women took on more responsibilities. Factories that had produced merchandise such as coats, suits, and other garments began to make uniforms for the soldiers. The jobs that were traditionally held by men and replaced by women were seen as masculine jobs. Throughout most of history, women were long considered naturally weaker than men, squeamish, and unable to perform work requiring muscular or intellectual development. In most pre-industrial societies, for example, domestic chores were regulated to women, leaving heavier labor such as hunting and plowing to men. This ignored the fact that caring for children and doing such tasks as milking cows and washing clothes also required heavy sustained labor. Before World War I, men, who were considered the breadwinners and heads of the household, held most of the jobs in factories. When some 16 million males enlisted or were drafted into the military, employers referred to as essential industrial opportunities for women. Women were believed to have better motor skills than men, which was said to be from the common practice of needlework, so they were useful with wire fuses on bombs and to fill metal casings with gunpowder. The women worked very long hours, but were proud to help out the war in as many ways as possible. This was an opportunity for women to grow and learn the job skills that they were never allowed to. The war created employment for women, liberating them, while also changing their traditional roles. Jackie Cochran earned her pilot's license in 1932, 10 years before the initiation of the WASP program. Growing up in West Florida, she grew up in poverty, never owning a pair of shoes until she was 9 years old. Her lack of poverty and education did not deter her from her dream of flying. With a love for the sight of an airplane, she believed she would one day fly. She entered her first race 2 years after receiving her license. By 1935, she had become best friends with Amelia Earhart and entered her first Bendix Air Race. In 1935, she became the first woman to fly in the Bendix Trophy Race, a race dominated by males, which she won in 1938. Cochran received the General Willie E. Mitchell Memorial Award as the person making the greatest contribution to aviation that year. In 1939, Hitler's troops began marching across Europe. Cochran began to consider the possibility of women being involved and assisting in flying America's military aircraft. With the influence of Eleanor Roosevelt, she approached General Hap Arnold with her plans for using women pilots if they were ever needed. Arnold rejected her plans. Cochran then used her influence with Eleanor Roosevelt to convince the War Department to create the Women's Flying Training Department, a program to train young women as pilots with her as the director of the program. By the spring of 1942, due to a shortage of male pilots, Air Force leaders gambled on an experimental program to help fill the void. Used trained women to fly military aircraft so male pilots could be released for combat duty overseas. General Arnold then asked Cochran to put her plans into operation. On September 11, 1942, she was appointed director of the Women's Flying Training for the United States. The group of female pilots soon to be trained under the Air Force military became known as the Women Air Force Service Pilots, WASPs for short. Many women believed that they might never be allowed to serve in the military again if they did not prove to be capable in a chosen role. 25,000 women applied for training. Only 1,800 were admitted, of which 1,000 completed the training and were assigned to operational duty. The training program began initially at Hughes Airport in Houston, Texas, but moved to Sweetwater, Texas due to lack of facilities. A few more than 1,000 young women, all civilian volunteers, flew almost every type of military aircraft, including the B-26 and the B-29 bombers, as a part of the WASP program. The experimental flying training was successful, and in July 1943, Cochran was appointed to the General Staff of the U.S. Army Air Forces to direct all phases of the Women Air Force Service Pilot Program at 120 air bases all over America. After World War I, women became free to create their own lives and sense of self. With this increase in freedom also came an increase in equality. World War II gave women the chance to prove they were just as capable as men. As World War II continued, greater numbers of women began to take control. For the first time, women in the United States were learning to work as factory workers, nurses, and journalists. World War II also brought about an increase in women as subjects of propaganda. Life for women was changing. Women had their own money and could do with it what they pleased. They became more independent. War taught them how to stand on their own 2 feet. Though relatively short-lived, World War II provided a way for women to do what they wanted. Far fewer obstacles stood in the way of women, proving that they were extremely capable. The Women Air Force Service Pilots were a largely depicting part of women taking their role in the world during the 20th century. The Women Air Force Service Pilot training spanned 19 groups of women. Jacqueline Cochran's first class of the 19 classes of women pilots were called the Guinea Pigs. They were trained to fly the Army Ray by the U.S. Army Air Forces at Avenger Field in Sweetwater, Texas. They were not trained for combat. Their course of instruction, however, was essentially the same as that for aviation cadets. After training, the WASP were stationed at 120 air bases across the U.S., assuming numerous flight-related missions and relieving male pilots for combat duty. They flew 60 million miles of operational flights from aircraft factories to ports of embarkation and military training bases. Between September 1942 and December 1944, the Women Air Force Service Pilots delivered 12,650 aircraft of 78 different types. During their 2 years of training and service, the WASP held their own, matching and sometimes exceeding the male Air Force pilots' records and abilities. In 1944, bills in Congress to militarize the WASPs met with strong opposition from some individuals, including famed columnist Drew Pearson, and failed like other attempts. The last Women Air Force Service Pilot training class graduated at Sweetwater on December 7, 1944. Due to political pressures and the increasing availability of male pilots, the WASP were disbanded on December 20, 1944, with no benefits. At the graduation ceremony, General Arnold told the last crop of pilots, "We of the AAF are proud of you. We will never forget our debt to you." But after the war ended the next year, the WASPs were in fact forgotten. They went back to their former lives, continued flying at a non-commercial airline or became airline stewardesses. Their records were classified and sealed from the public. On November 23, 1977, President Carter signed Public Law 95-202, Title VI. This granted former WASP veteran status with limited benefits. Coincidentally, the Air Force graduated its first female pilots the same year. More recognition followed in the future years. The first Women Air Force Service Pilots received discharge certificates in 1979, and in 1984 they received World War II victory medals. Finally, in 2002, the surviving WASP, of which there were less than 300, and the families of the deceased received their Congressional Gold Medals. The Women Air Force Service Pilots left a legacy, and although shortly forgotten, they will always be remembered.